The popular image of the British Empire at its zenith is one of overwhelming visible power. We picture the solid red wall of infantry, the thunder of heavy artillery, and the rigid discipline of the square formation repelling waves of disorganized attackers. It is a picture of order imposed upon chaos. But this image is a deception. It masks a far more fragile reality that haunted British commanders from the forests of North America to the mountain passes of Afghanistan. For all its industrial might and drill square precision, the British Army in the 18th and 19th centuries suffered from a critical, often fatal weakness. It was a giant, certainly, but for long stretches of its history, it was a blind giant. To understand the terrifying cost of this blindness, we must look to the rocky slopes of Isandlwana in January 1879. Here, a modern British force, equipped with Martini Henry rifles and artillery, was not just defeated but annihilated by a Zulu army armed primarily with spears and hide shields. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, had divided his forces. He was hunting the Zulu army, convinced they were elusive and unwilling to fight. In reality, 20,000 Zulu warriors had outmaneuvered him, concealing their movements in the folds of the terrain until they were literally on top of his camp. The British scouts had failed. The intelligence was non-existent. The result was the destruction of the 24th Regiment of Foot. The sun that set over Isandlwana shone on the red coats of over 1,300 dead men. They died not because they lacked courage or firepower, but because they lacked information. This disaster underscores the central theme of our journey today. We are stepping away from the parade ground to explore the shadow war. This is the untold story of how the British Empire learned to see. In the conventional wars of Europe, armies maneuvered on known maps. Generals like Marlborough or Napoleon fought on open fields where the enemy was visible, and the terrain was a chessboard of predictable variables. But as the empire expanded into the wild frontiers of the New World, the dense jungles of Asia, and the arid deserts of the Middle East, the chessboard was smashed. The British found themselves fighting what we today call asymmetric warfare. Their enemies did not stand in lines. They struck from the tree line, vanished into the mist, and manipulated the landscape to bleed the invader dry. In these alien environments, a regiment of infantry was useless if it did not know where to march. The traditional methods of reconnaissance, sending a cavalry patrol over the next hill, often resulted only in dead horses and missing men. The empire needed a new weapon. It needed eyes that could pierce the fog of war. It needed intelligence. This necessity gave birth to a breed of soldier and operative entirely different from the rigid aristocrats who commanded the regiments. These were men who walked the razor's edge between two worlds. They were the spies in the wilderness, the cartographers who mapped forbidden lands while disguised as holy men, and the rough frontiersmen who learned to scalp and track better than the indigenous warriors they fought. From the snow-covered forests of New England to the scorching plains of the Great Game in Central Asia, these individuals waged a lonely, dangerous war, where a single piece of paper, a stolen map, or a whispered conversation in a bazaar was worth more than 1,000 muskets. We will trace this evolution of British intelligence gathering from its desperate ad hoc beginnings to a sophisticated instrument of imperial power. We will see how the humiliating defeats in the American forests forced a tactical revolution, birthing the very concept of special forces. We will follow the aristocratic exploring officers of the Napoleonic Wars who treated espionage as a deadly sport. And we will walk with the pundits of India who measured the roof of the world one step at a time, hiding their purpose behind the rhythm of prayer beads. This is not a story of battles won by overwhelming force. It is a story of survival, deception, and the desperate race to acquire knowledge before the enemy strikes. It is the story of how the British Empire, often stumbling and blooded, learned that in the brutal colonial frontier, information was the only currency that mattered. And it begins, appropriately, in the deep freeze of an American winter, where the rules of European warfare were frozen to death, and a new, darker art of war was being invented. To witness the birth of this new method, we must wind the clock back to the 1750s, deep into the dense, suffocating woodlands of North America during the 7 Years' War. Here, the British Army faced a crisis of competence. They were pitted against the French and their Native American allies, masters of the ambush who moved through the forest like smoke. The standard British response was to march in columns, beat drums, and level muskets in volley fire. Against a European line, this was devastating. Against an enemy hiding behind every tree and rock, it was suicide. The shock of this reality hit home with the disastrous defeat of General Edward Braddock in 1755. Braddock carved a road through the wilderness, a noisy, slow-moving scar in the forest that announced his position for miles. His force was decimated not by superior numbers, but by superior intelligence and concealment. The British regulars, terrified and confused, fired blindly into the trees, often hitting their own men, while the unseen enemy picked them off at will. It was a massacre that proved a redcoat in the woods was nothing more than a slow-moving target. Out of this carnage emerged a man who offered a radical alternative. Robert Rogers was a colonial frontiersman, a man who viewed the forest not as a chaotic nightmare, but as a readable text. He understood that to defeat the enemy, the British had to become them. He proposed raising a company of irregulars, men who would discard the stiff uniforms and heavy equipment of the line infantry. They would wear green and grey to blend with the foliage. They would carry hatchets and knives alongside their muskets. And most importantly, they would operate independently, acting as the eyes and ears of the blind army. Rogers' Rangers were the first institutional attempt by the British military to systematize intelligence gathering in the frontier. Their primary mission was not always to fight, but to range. They were to penetrate deep behind enemy lines, often in the dead of winter, when the regular armies were huddled in winter quarters. They utilized snowshoes and ice skates to move rapidly across the frozen landscape, covering distances that European commanders deemed impossible. A ranger patrol might travel dozens of miles in a single night, observing French forts, counting supply wagons, and capturing prisoners for interrogation. Rogers codified this doctrine in his famous Rules of Ranging. These 28 regulations were a manual for survival and surveillance that reads like a modern special forces handbook. He taught his men to march in single file to hide their numbers, to encircle their own camp at night to catch enemy scouts, and to never return by the same path they went out, lest they be ambushed. But the core of the doctrine was information. Rule number 21 explicitly stated that, if the enemy was superior, the Rangers were to disperse and regroup, avoiding a fight to preserve the intelligence they had gathered. The objective was the report, not the glory. The life of these early intelligence operatives was brutally hard. They slept in the snow without fires to avoid detection. They ate cold rations or starved. If a ranger was injured on a deep penetration mission, he was often left behind or hidden, as carrying him would doom the entire patrol. It was a cold, pragmatic existence. Yet, the intelligence they gathered was invaluable. They provided the British High Command with the first clear pictures of the French disposition. They mapped the waterways and trails that the main army would eventually use to strike at the heart of New France. Rogers himself was a complex, often difficult figure, but his legacy was undeniable. He proved that the British military machine could adapt. He showed that in the wilderness, a small group of highly trained, observant men was worth more than a battalion of blind infantry. The Rangers stripped away the pomp and circumstance of warfare to reveal its essential core, knowing where the enemy is and striking him where he is weak. This was the lesson of the American forests, a lesson bought in blood that would travel back across the Atlantic and evolve further as the British turned their eyes toward a new and even more dangerous adversary on the continent of Europe. As the 18th century bled into the 19th, the theatre of war shifted dramatically. The ragged forests of the New World gave way to the sun-baked plains of Spain and Portugal. The enemy was no longer the elusive indigenous warrior, but the mighty war machine of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the Peninsular War, the Duke of Wellington faced a terrifying equation. He was consistently outnumbered by French forces. To survive, let alone win, he could not afford to guess. He needed to know the mind of the French marshals better than they knew it themselves. Wellington, a man of cold precision, famously distrusted local spies. He found their reports exaggerated, tainted by bias, or simply bought by the highest bidder. He wanted intelligence he could trust implicitly. His solution was to adapt the lessons of the American frontier, but to clothe them in the scarlet of the British officer class. He created the exploring officers. These were not rough frontiersmen, but often aristocrats, the finest horsemen in the army, mounted on the best fox hunters England could produce. Their job was to ride not just to the front lines, but through them. These men operated in a peculiar grey zone of warfare. Unlike modern spies who hide in the shadows, exploring officers, like the legendary Colonial Grant, often operated in full uniform. This was a calculated risk. If caught in civilian clothes, they would be hanged as spies. If caught in uniform, they were prisoners of war. This distinction allowed them to ride with audacious openness deep into French territory. They would crest a ridge, observe a French column on the march, count the battalions, note the artillery, and then gallop away before the French cavalry could catch them. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out on horseback. Colonial Grant was the master of this art. He was said to be worth a brigade of cavalry to Wellington. Grant did not just observe, he infiltrated the social fabric of the war. He spoke fluent French and, when necessary, would shed his uniform for the disguise of an American traveller. In this guise, he would boldly ride into French-occupied towns, stabling his horse alongside those of the enemy officers, and dining in the same taverns. He gathered intelligence not by stealing documents, but by listening to the gossip of soldiers who never suspected the polite traveller was the eyes of the Iron Duke. The most extraordinary example of Grant's prowess, and the strange chivalry that still existed in this era, occurred after his capture. Caught by French dragoons after a frantic chase, Grant was brought before the French Marshal Massena. Instead of a dungeon, he was treated as a guest, a fellow officer of distinction. Grant gave his parole, a gentleman's promise not to escape, and was allowed to dine at the Marshal's table. It was here, in the heart of the enemy headquarters, that the ultimate intelligence coup took place. While Massena chatted amiably, Grant's eyes were devouring the maps spread out on the Marshal's table. He memorized the disposition of the French corps, the supply lines, and the intended routes of march. He absorbed the strategic picture that Wellington was desperate to see. When Massena eventually realized that Grant was too dangerous to keep near the front and ordered him sent to France, Grant considered his parole voided by the change in circumstances. He eventually escaped, bringing with him the secrets of the French High Command. This episode reveals the unique nature of British intelligence in this period. It was personal, driven by individual initiative, and relied heavily on the sheer nerve of the operative. These men were the human censors of the army. They slept in the saddle, wrote reports on scraps of paper in the rain, and lived with the constant adrenaline of the chase. They mapped the peninsula, not just geographically, but tactically. Wellington's reliance on men like Grant marked a shift in military thinking. It moved the British Army away from the idea that a general should simply react to what he could see from his horse. It embraced the concept of deep reconnaissance, of projecting one's vision miles beyond the horizon. The exploring officers proved that a single man, armed with a telescope, a fast horse, and a sharp mind, could defeat the fog of war. But as the empire expanded east, the horse would be traded for a camel, the uniform for a robe, and the gentlemanly rules of war would be left behind entirely in the brutal, shadow-filled game of Central Asia. If the Peninsular War was a contest of armies, the conflict that unfolded in the vast, arid expanse between India and Russia was a war of shadows. Historians call it the Great Game, a century-long strategic chess match played on the roof of the world. The prize was the jewel in the British crown, India. The fear was that the Russian Empire, expanding inexorably southwards, would pour through the mountain passes of Afghanistan and wash away British rule. To prevent this, the empire needed to know what was happening in the khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and the courts of Kabul. But unlike Spain, a British officer could not simply ride here in uniform. To enter these lands was to invite death. In this paranoid atmosphere, the nature of British intelligence shifted again. It moved from battlefield reconnaissance to deep cover cultural infiltration. The operatives chosen for this work were a peculiar breed of scholar soldier. They were men possessed by a restless curiosity, linguists who could speak Persian and Pashto, and actors who could shed their British identity like a second skin. They were asked to leave behind the safety of the Raj and vanish into the bazaars of Central Asia, relying solely on their wits to survive. The archetype of this new shadow warrior was Alexander Burnes. Charismatic, ambitious, and dangerously confident, Burnes became known to the world as Bokhara Burnes after his audacious journey to that forbidden city. Unlike the stoic rangers of America, Burnes revelled in the role-play of espionage. He travelled not as a conqueror, but as a chameleon. He would dye his hair, don the robes of an Afghan merchant or a holy man, and travel with the caravans that wound through the Khyber Pass. Burnes's mission was multifaceted. He was mapping the terrain, certainly, noting the depth of rivers and the fodder available for horses, but he was also mapping the political landscape. He dined with emirs and tribal warlords, using his charm to gauge their loyalties. Was this Khan swaying toward Russia? Was that tribe open to British gold? He carried out his work in the open, often hiding in plain sight. He relied on the assumption that a man who spoke the language and observed the customs could pass unnoticed, or at least be tolerated, in places where a red coat would be a death sentence. However, Burnes represented a dangerous paradox in British intelligence, the celebrity spy. Upon his return from his first great expedition, he wrote a best-selling book about his travels. He became the toast of London society, celebrated for his daring. But in the world of espionage, fame is a liability. When he returned to Kabul as a political agent, he was no longer the anonymous merchant. He was the face of British meddling. He set up residence in the city, living in style, convinced that his knowledge of the Afghan people made him untouchable. He believed he had his finger on the pulse of the city. He was wrong. The shadow war in Afghanistan was not just about gathering information, it was about interpreting it correctly. Burnes, blinded by his own arrogance and his belief in his influence, failed to see the resentment boiling around him. The intelligence network he built was extensive, but it filtered out the hard truths he didn't want to hear. He dismissed rumours of a brewing insurrection as minor discontent. The price of this failure was paid on a cold November morning in 1841. The mob that gathered outside his residence in Kabul didn't come for the army, they came for the spy. Burnes was the first prominent victim of the disastrous First Anglo-Afghan War. He was hacked to death in his own garden while trying to escape in disguise. A grim irony for a man who had made his name by mastering the art of deception. His death signaled the collapse of the British position in Kabul and the subsequent retreat that saw an entire army destroyed in the snow. The tragedy of Alexander Burnes taught the British Empire a brutal lesson. Cultural knowledge and linguistic skill were powerful tools, but they were not armour. The great game could not be won by charisma alone. As the borders of the empire solidified, the need for intelligence became less about the dashing adventures of individual officers and more about the cold, hard data of scientific measurement. The British realized that if they could not safely send their own men into the high Himalayas to map the route to Tibet, they would have to build a new kind of machine. They would have to recruit from within, inventing a method of spying that turned the very act of walking into a weapon of war. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India sounds like a dry academic exercise. a project to measure triangles and mountain peaks. In reality, it was one of the most audacious military intelligence operations in history. By the mid-19th century, the British had mapped much of India, but to the north lay the forbidden land, Tibet. The borders were sealed. Any European caught trying to enter Lhasa, the holy city, was turned back or executed. Yet, the British obsession with the Russian threat demanded that these white spaces on the map be filled. They needed to know if there were passes large enough for a Russian army to march through. If a British officer couldn't walk there, they needed someone who could. Enter Captain Thomas Montgomery, a visionary officer of the Royal Engineers. He realized that the solution lay not in disguise, but in authenticity. He recruited men from the Himalayan borderlands, Bhotiars and Tibetans, who could travel freely across the frontiers as traders or pilgrims. These men were known as the pundits. They were not just spies, they were human scientific instruments, trained in the rigorous discipline of surveying, yet taught to hide their work within the rituals of religion. The training was grueling. Montgomery taught them to walk with a stride of exactly 33 inches, regardless of the slope or terrain. They practiced this until it was muscle memory, a rhythmic metronome in their legs. To count these steps over thousands of miles without drawing attention, Montgomery engineered a brilliant adaptation of a common religious artifact, the Buddhist rosary. A traditional mala, or prayer necklace, contains 108 beads. Montgomery removed 8, leaving exactly 100. The pundit would slip his hand into his robe, fingering the beads as he walked. For every 100 paces, exactly 2,000 steps per mile, he would drop 1 bead. It looked like pious devotion. In reality, it was a decimal calculator. A full circuit of the rosary meant 10,000 paces. This allowed them to measure distances of incredible magnitude with startling accuracy, all while mumbling prayers under the nose of suspicious border guards. But distance was useless without direction. Here, the pundits utilized the prayer wheel, a cylinder spun by a handle believed to send prayers to heaven. The British modified these wheels to house a compass for taking bearings. The scroll of prayers inside was replaced with blank paper for recording data. When a pundit was stopped for questioning, he would simply spin his wheel, hiding his notes in plain sight behind a blur of religious fervor. To measure altitude, crucial for finding passes an army could use, they carried mercury thermometers hidden in their hollow walking staffs. By boiling water and checking the temperature at which it boiled, they could calculate their height above sea level. The most famous of these operatives was Nain Singh Rawat, known in the classified files simply as Number 1. In 1865, he embarked on a journey that would become legend. He walked from Nepal to Lhasa, a journey of over 1,000 miles across the roof of the world. For months, he counted every single pace. He slept in frozen caves, survived bandit attacks, and navigated the treacherous politics of the road. When he finally reached Lhasa, he risked his life to map the city, determining its exact latitude and altitude, and even observing the Dalai Lama. When Nain Singh returned to India 2 years later, he looked like a broken man. His skin was leathery, his hair matted, and his body exhausted. But inside his prayer wheel were the secrets of Tibet. He had mapped the course of the Great Sangpo River and fixed the location of the Forbidden City. His work and that of the other pundits gave the British Empire the keys to the Himalayas. They turned the terrifying unknown into a grid of coordinates. The pundits represent the zenith of human intelligence gathering, where physical endurance met scientific ingenuity. But as the 19th century raced toward its conclusion, the speed of war was accelerating. The pace of a walking man was no longer enough. The empire spanned the globe, and to hold it, the British needed to communicate across continents in seconds, not months. The shadow war was about to go electric. The transition from the foot-slogging pundit to the electric age was violent and abrupt. In 1857, the Indian Mutiny erupted, threatening to tear the British Raj apart. As rebel sepoys seized Delhi and severed the lines of command, the British were saved by a thin copper wire. The electric telegraph, recently installed across the subcontinent, allowed a dying operator in Delhi to tap out a final, desperate warning to the garrisons in the Punjab before he was cut down. That message allowed the British to disarm wavering regiments and mobilize their forces. A captured rebel leader was later said to have pointed at the telegraph pole and admitted, "There is the accursed string that strangles us." The telegraph became the central nervous system of the empire. It collapsed the distance between the frontier and the headquarters from weeks to minutes. However, a wire is a static thing. It can be cut, tapped, or simply does not exist in the rugged mountains of the Hindu Kush or the veldt of South Africa. In these mobile wars, the British Army turned to a device that looked like a surveyor's tool, but acted like a weapon: the heliograph. This instrument used a mirror to catch the sun and flash beams of light across vast distances. By tilting the mirror with a key, a trained operator could transmit Morse code in blinding flashes visible for up to 50 miles on a clear day. In the Second Anglo-Afghan War and the Zulu War, the heliograph was the primary means of tactical communication. It allowed a commander on a mountain peak to direct columns in the valley below, coordinating movements with a speed the enemy could not match. But this new speed brought a new danger. A message sent via heliograph is visible to everyone for miles around. If the enemy knew Morse code, and increasingly they did, or had European advisors who did, the British were broadcasting their plans to the world. This necessitated a revolution in cryptography. The gentleman's code, of writing in Latin or vague allusions, was replaced by rigorous field ciphers. The British Army adopted systems like the Playfair cipher, a manual symmetric encryption technique that could be used quickly in a muddy trench without complex machinery. A message like "attack at dawn" would be scrambled into pairs of letters based on a keyword known only to the commanders. This was the birth of signals intelligence as a discipline. It wasn't just about stealing the enemy's secrets anymore. It was about protecting your own while shouting them across the sky in bursts of light. Yet, despite these technological leaps, the human element remained the weak link. Machines could transmit data, but they couldn't interpret intent. The British possessed the technology to talk, but they still lacked a central brain to listen. The era of the lone wolf, the daring amateur like Burns or Grant, was ending. The complexity of modern warfare demanded that espionage be taken out of the hands of adventurers and placed into the hands of professionals. The shadow war was about to be institutionalized. For most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the memory of the British Army lived in the heads of its officers. If a general died or retired, the specific knowledge of a region often vanished with him. There was no central repository, no library of secrets. Intelligence was an ad hoc affair, gathered when a war started and discarded when it ended. This amateur approach was sustainable when fighting disorganized tribal forces, but as the European powers began to industrialize warfare, the British realized they were dangerously behind. The shock came not from a British defeat, but from a Prussian victory. In 1870, the Prussian army dismantled the French forces with terrifying efficiency during the Franco-Prussian War. The British onlookers were stunned. The Prussians won not just with rifles, but with a general staff, a dedicated body of officers whose sole job was to study war, map potential battlefields, and analyze enemies years before a shot was fired. The British Army, by contrast, looked like a gentleman's club. In response to this wake-up call, the intelligence branch of the War Office was formally established in 1873. This marked the end of the era of the lone adventurer. The romantic figure of the spy in Afghan robes was replaced by a new kind of warrior, the bureaucrat. The intelligence branch began the unglamorous but vital work of systematizing the world. They devoured information. They subscribed to foreign newspapers, translated technical journals, and debriefed travelers returning from the colonies. The man who epitomized this shift was Major General Henry Brackenbury. He transformed the department from a dusty archive into the brain of the army. Under his guidance, intelligence became a science of prediction. He understood that in modern war, you could not wait until the declaration of hostilities to find out how many cannons the enemy possessed. You had to know it 5 years ago. However, the creation of a department did not cure the army's blindness overnight. The tragedy of the Second Boer War in 1899 serves as the final, bloody exam for British colonial intelligence. The intelligence branch had actually done its job. They had produced an accurate estimate of the Boer Republic's strength. They knew the Boers had purchased modern German artillery and Mauser rifles. They knew the Boers could mobilize tens of thousands of mounted commandos. The secret information files in London contained the truth, but the generals on the ground refused to read them. Steeped in the arrogance of the Victorian era, commanders like Sir Redvers Buller could not conceive that a group of farmers could challenge the British army. They dismissed the intelligence reports as pessimistic nonsense. They chose to believe their own prejudices rather than the data. The result was Black Week, a series of 3 disastrous defeats where the British army was hammered by the very artillery and tactics the intelligence branch had warned them about. This was the hardest lesson of the Shadow War. You can build the most sophisticated spy networks in the world. You can map the mountains of Tibet and crack the codes of the Zulu. You can file every fact in a cabinet in Whitehall. But intelligence is useless if the commanders lack the humility to listen. The Boer War forced a reckoning. It proved that the amateur spirit, the idea that a British gentleman could simply muddle through, was dead. War was now a profession, and information was its primary tool. As the smoke cleared over the South African veldt and the 19th century turned into the 20th, the foundations of the modern surveillance state had been laid. The ad hoc networks of Rogers Rangers and the solitary wanderings of the pundits had evolved into a permanent, institutionalized machine. The empire had finally learned to see, but the cost of that vision had been catastrophic. And as the new century dawned, this machine would turn its eyes back to Europe, ready for a conflict that would dwarf all the colonial skirmishes combined. We have journeyed from the bloody snow of the American frontier to the hushed corridors of Whitehall. We have seen how a military culture built on the rigid honour of the open field was forced to descend into the murky, morally ambiguous world of espionage. This transformation was not an accident. It was a survival mechanism. The British Empire, for all its projected strength, was an organism stretched too thin. It could not be everywhere at once. It survived only by knowing where to be, and more importantly, where not to be. The legacy of this shadow war is woven into the very DNA of modern statecraft. The methods forged in the desperate heat of colonial conflict did not vanish with the redcoats. They evolved. The rough and ready tactics of Rogers Rangers, the small unit, the deep penetration, the reliance on stealth, are the direct ancestors of the Special Air Service and the modern commando. When you look at a modern Special Forces operator, you are looking at the spiritual descendant of the Ranger in his greenskins, sliding through the New England forest on snowshoes. Similarly, the solitary, exploring officers, like Calhoun Grant and Alexander Burns, laid the groundwork for the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6. They established the archetype of the intelligence officer, a person of culture and education who uses social grace as a cover for gathering hard data. The Great Game taught the British government that intelligence was not a military luxury, but a diplomatic necessity. It taught them that to influence the world, you must understand it, map it, and occasionally manipulate it from within. However, we must not romanticize this legacy entirely. The Shadow War was a brutal business. It was built on betrayal. For every British officer who won a medal for his daring, there were dozens of local informants, Afghan tribesmen, Native American scouts, Indian pundits, who were used, exposed, and discarded. The pundits of the Survey of India, men of immense courage and intellect, were paid a pittance and often died in poverty. Their names kept out of the history books for decades, to protect the secrecy of the operation. The maps they drew were masterpieces of science, but they were also instruments of conquest, paving the way for armies to subjugate the very lands these men called home. The intelligence gathered during this era did more than win battles. It shaped our understanding of the globe. The maps we use today, the borders that define nations in the Middle East and South Asia, are often the result of lines drawn by these weary spies in their tents. The Great Trigonometrical Survey didn't just measure India, it defined it. The British desire to see the world ended up fixing the world in a specific imperial image, the consequences of which we are still living with today. As we look back at the 18th and 19th centuries, we must look past the dazzle of the scarlet uniforms and the smoke of the muskets. We must look into the negative space of the history books. There, in the margins, we find the true architects of the empire. We find the men who counted their steps to Lhasa, the riders who memorized the French maps, and the rangers who learned to fight in the dark. They fought a war without applause, often without recognition, and sometimes without honor. The British Empire has long since retreated from the frontiers. The forts are ruins, the telegraph lines are rusted, but the lesson of the Shadow War remains absolute. In the conflict between nations, the greatest weapon is not the rifle, the cannon, or the battleship. The greatest weapon is the truth, stolen, deciphered, and delivered before the enemy awakes. The redcoats have marched away, but the eyes they opened are still watching. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.